Hello everybody, my name is Kara and hello everybody, my name is Kara and today I am here with my July wrap-up. So as usual, this will be filmed in two parts, and not as usual, I have a special guest here. This is my cat Petey. He did not want to leave the room, so hopefully he behaves himself. The first book I finished in July was The Taming of the Shrew by Stephanie Kate Strom. This is a contemporary retelling of The Taming of the Shrew, and our main character is a girl named Cass, and she's been selected for this highly competitive summer Shakespeare program. Only a few high school students are chosen per year, and they're going to be putting on a production of Taming of the Shrew. She clashes with this boy named Drew, but one of her roommates and friends has a crush on him, and so what the synopsis makes it sound like is that Cass kind of gets the idea to like help him work on his personality. And throughout this process, she starts developing feelings for him too. But that's not really what happens in this book, because what actually happens in the plot is Cass gets really mad at Drew, and she decides that under cover of trying to like make him a better boyfriend for her friend, she's going to do all the things that they do in the Taming of the Shrew play to Katerina. She decides that she's going to do them to Drew to get revenge on him. And I really didn't like this book. Actually, I kind of hated it. And I had a real issue with the story, first of all. I just don't generally enjoy pranks in stories or in real life. I don't find them funny. I don't find them entertaining. And so if I had known that, I might not have picked up this book. But also, it's not even really a prank war, because like one of the other characters in this book, one of Cass's friends, when Cass unveils her plan of like doing all of the things in the play to Drew, one of the girls, Heidi, actually brings up that those things that Petruchio does to Kate in the play are actually considered forms of torture, which is true. Under the Geneva Convention, all of the things that he does to her are considered torture. And so Heidi's like, wouldn't it also be bad to do them to him? Like, just because he's a boy, it doesn't mean that it's acceptable to treat people this way. And Cass blows it off. She's like, no, totally different, because feminism. And I just really didn't like that. I really wasn't invested in the romance because Cass kind of sucked as a person, and even Drew, I just like didn't find him a very interesting character. Their banter was not very good. I just really didn't care about their relationship. And there was also this subplot involving like skater boys, and it was the most obnoxious and unnecessary thing. Like, I honestly thought they were written in as like a joke, and then it turns out no, they're like a significant subplot in this book. Their dialogue was just absolutely ridiculous. I'm like, has this author ever heard a teen speak? Like, ever? One of the only things I did like about this book was Cass's friends, Heidi, and I can't remember the other girl's name. They were very nice. They were very interesting people. I would have loved if this book were about them instead. Basically, the only things I kind of liked about this book are Heidi and her other friend, because they deserved better. Occasionally there would be some moments about working in the theater or about Shakespeare that I thought were really good, that I really enjoyed, because obviously I enjoy theater and Shakespeare. And also the fact that I did read this book very quickly, but I hated just about every second of it. And even as far as the like theater elements go, I was really irritated at the way, like the inconsistent way this like summer program was portrayed. Cause like, was it supposed to be serious or not? Because the way that one of their like teachers or like advisors is portrayed is just like the most cartoonish version of like a theater instructor. Like this very stereotypical idea of like what actors do all day is basically like what that teacher is. So that was really irritating. But on the other hand, like Cass's resistance to the exercises they were doing is also really irritating, because I'm like, if you're a serious theater student, you understand that sometimes you have to do exercises that feel a little silly. So I don't know. It was just, this book was a mess. I hated it. I gave it 1.5 stars. Yeah, do not recommend. Next, I finished They Were Her Property, White Women as Slave Owners in the American South by Stephanie E. Jones-Rogers. This is a nonfiction book about what the title says. It's about white women as slave owners in the antebellum South. It collects a lot of like firsthand accounts and research and analysis that all adds up to this picture of white women as slave owners who had a real stake in the slave market, who were actively involved in slavery and the slave market. And I just think this was a really important book, because I think a lot of the times the way we learn about slavery in schools is very much focused on the men involved in the slave market, like the overseers or like the masters of the house and all of this. And there's kind of this almost implicit idea that the white women were less culpable. Or like sometimes they would mistreat their personal slaves, but like the people who were really active in in slavery were their husbands, or were the overseers, or were the white men, basically. And that is absolutely not true. And this book shows a lot of reasons or examples of why that's not true and how we know that's not true. White women who bought and sold slaves, who were very deeply involved in slavery as an institution, white women who were in charge of the punishment of their slaves, white women who themselves beat their slaves. Like, they didn't just delegate this to overseers, they were like actively involved in the punishment and torture of the enslaved people that were considered their property. So this was just a really important book. It's obviously very difficult to read at times. Definitely check content warnings that I will list down below as always. I think the author did a really excellent job of showing specific examples or specific quotations. She would like pull out like a single conversation or a single interaction, and she would talk about what we know from this interaction, and then she would use that to like talk about the larger picture. Like, look at the way that this interaction shows us that this very young white girl already has some idea of the fact that she occupies a different place than this little girl that she's playing with who is black and a slave. Like, look at how young this idea of superiority starts. I also thought it was really interesting learning about the way that laws were set up in the South, because I think another misconception about this time period is that white women didn't really have a lot of recourse to the law, like for anything, but like including for their own rights and their own rights of property, specifically of their slaves that they owned. And this book shows how that is absolutely not true. Yes, they had limitations placed on them that the men in their lives did not, but these white women were like full and active participants in slavery. Like, it wasn't like it just happened around them, you know? There were a few chapters in the beginning especially where I felt like, even though she cites everything meticulously, a couple of the earlier chapters were a little harder to get through because it felt like the author was kind of like laying down a bunch of quotations or examples and not really transitioning between paragraphs as smoothly. Like, she wasn't really incorporating them into like the argument that she was making as much near the beginning of the book. Like, overall this book was just really well put together, just a very important one that I think more people should read, and I gave They Were Her Property 4 stars. Next, I finished For Everyone by Jason Reynolds, and this is a very, very short book or novella. I don't really know how to describe it. On Goodreads I shelved it under poetry and also under nonfiction, because that's what kind of felt right to me, but this is like essentially is it a narrative poem or a long form poem that is about, it's about dreamers, and it's about how there's not a specific time that you need to achieve a dream by. And this is one where I think, like, depending on how much you need to hear something like this, you would have like a vastly different experience. But I found this incredibly powerful. I love the way that Jason Reynolds doesn't talk about like just one example of a dream or of a passion. Like, he's a writer, so I kind of went into this expecting that a lot of what he was talking about would speak directly to writers, and there was some about that, but he also talked about other forms of art. He talked about people whose dream is like having a family. I was just really impressed at the way that he showed the variety there, because I think a lot of times that's not something we see in these kinds of like stories or pieces. And I also found this even more effective for the fact that he wrote this before he became successful as an author. Like, this was written from the middle of that doubt and that passion, and how like this idea of finding something you love so much that you don't really even understand how you could give up on it, but how you still feel tempted to sometimes. Like, I think if he had gone back and revised this or like kind of rewritten it after his success, I'm not saying it wouldn't have been powerful, but I think it would have felt different. Whereas I feel like because he didn't revise this, because this was written in the middle of that uncertainty and him wanting to speak to other people who have those same feelings, I think it helped me feel more seen. I feel like it felt more comforting and more inspiring because it came from the middle of that, rather than him looking back and being like, oh yeah, I used to be uncertain about this. This really, really spoke to me. I loved it. I gave it 5 stars. Next, I finished I'm Still Here, Black Dignity in a World Made for Whiteness by Austen Channing Brown. This is a nonfiction book that is, I think, actually a collection of essays, and it's essentially a memoir of Austen Channing Brown's life and her experiences with racism, and especially in particular contexts or organizations. A lot of it was about her experiences in like nonprofits or like religious spaces, or these places that like considered themselves very very liberal and very inclusive and very like egalitarian, and how that's not always the case. That's not even often the case. I also love the way that she wrote. She writes with clarity and with beauty at the same time. And I was also super impressed at the way this book was organized, the way that she like structured this narrative. I actually didn't even realize this was a collection of essays until I saw other reviewers referring to it that way, because it feels so cohesive. This is one of my favorite nonfiction books now. It's powerful and unflinching, and there's still a little bit of hope there. This is also super short, so the fact that she can pack all of this information and all of these experiences and these these like really profound moments into such a short book is just really incredible, really impressive. I have not seen this on a lot of the like memoirs by Black authors that people are recommending, and I think a lot more people should be reading this one. I obviously gave I'm Still Here 5 stars. Next, I finished Somewhere Only We Know by Maureen Gu. This is a dual perspective contemporary novel, and one of our main characters is Lucky, and she's a K-pop star, and while she's on tour in Hong Kong, late at night she gets a craving for a hamburger, and she goes off on an adventure to try and find this, and she meets up with Jack, who's our other main character, and he is a tabloid photographer, and so Jack realizes that if he helps her out, he can get all these like candid photos and do like a special like expose or like piece on her, and that'll be like his big break, and it'll help him kind of move past this point in his career because he really wants to pursue more serious journalism. So he joins Lucky and says he's going to help her out. Meanwhile, he has this ulterior motive about why he is helping her. And so the rest of the book is about them like running around Hong Kong for the next day or so, or a couple days, and exploring the city and getting to know each other, and of course they start developing feelings for each other. And I really, really liked this. I had heard pretty negative reviews of this one, which I definitely understand. A lot of people mentioned like the premise for the book being really uncomfortable, which I totally understand. This book is also kind of loosely inspired by the movie Roman Holiday, which I love. And I think that's one of the reasons I enjoyed this book more than a lot of people did, is because I kind of went in prepared for those like unpleasant or problematic aspects. But yeah, I actually really enjoyed this one. I actually did a full spoiler-free review on this book. Hopefully that is already up by now. If it is, I will link it down below. So I won't go into too much detail, but I loved Lucky as a main character. I really loved the development of their relationship, even though it was such a quick one. I'm generally not somebody who enjoys fast developing romances. I loved the setting of Hong Kong, and I also really loved the way this book explored some really important themes in the guise of this cute rom-com. Gave Somewhere Only We Know 4 stars. Next, I finished Cry of Metal and Bone by Elle Penelope. This is book 3 in the Earthsinger Chronicle series, but this can be read as a standalone, and I received this copy free in a Goodreads giveaway in exchange for an honest review. Also, side note, but I just think this is such a beautiful cover. So this is a fantasy novel that is really hard to summarize. I feel like every time I talk about this book, I just end up directing you to Goodreads because I honestly don't know how to summarize this because there's a lot going on. We're set in a kingdom that's kind of like in the aftermath of a lot of conflict. We follow quite a few point of view characters. I'm just like straight up reading from the back of the book at this point. One of them is Lisbeth, a disgraced socialite seeking redemption for past mistakes. Tai Summerhawk, a foreign smuggler determined to keep a promise he made to a dead man. Darvin, who is a powerful Earthsinger who is sent with a secret assignment. Desminda, who is one of the people who is now in charge of this kingdom. Kiara, who is in a prison far away, who is trying to find a way to escape. I did really like this overall. I think this is a really solid fantasy. We definitely have a ton of point of view characters, actually even more than I read from the back of the book, but I think for the most part Elle Penelope did a good job of kind of keeping all the plot lines interesting. Like there were definitely some I preferred over others. There was one in particular where like we honestly just felt like we were waiting around for other characters to like meet up with her so that she could like be a part of the main plot. I thought the world building was really well done. This is kind of like an industrial fantasy world, which is not something I usually enjoy, and I was a little bit thrown off when I realized that's what was going on, but I think it ended up really working. I also really loved the social themes. That was probably one of my favorite things about this book, is the way that fantasy was used to explore like social issues, like ideas of persecution and immigration and justice or revenge versus forgiveness, and a lot of just really important topics. This book also deals a lot with refugees, and one of the point of view characters is wanting to adopt a couple of the orphans who have been forced to flee their homeland. And in the room where the children and the prospective adoptive parents are visiting, they have like toys and things set out. And this character has this moment of like, oh, none of these dolls look like these children. And she makes a mental note that she's going to buy some dolls that actually like look like them, that have similar like skin tones and hair color and everything. So just like little things like that I thought were really well done. I also thought it was really interesting to read a fantasy book that's kind of set after the conflict that would normally end a fantasy story. As far as negatives, I think sometimes this book was a little, like there was a little too much going on, like with all of those different point of views and all of those different like plot lines and things like that. It got a little unwieldy, I think, at points, and also some of the characters and character relationships I think developed a little too fast. Like in some cases there were tropes involved that I really enjoyed, so that kind of like helped a little bit. But overall I think this is a solid fantasy book, and I gave Cry of Metal and Bone 3.5 stars. Next I finished Fairy Godmothers Ink by Jennifer Wardell. This is I guess it's like a Cinderella fairy tale retelling, kind of, but we're actually following a fairy godmother as the main character, and she's kind of getting a little disillusioned with her job. Like, she enjoys helping people and she enjoys some of the other things of what she does, but she doesn't like the way that her company like relies on love potion to like essentially like force these romances to happen. So she's been getting kind of steadily more uncomfortable with this, and then she ends up meeting this boy named John, who turns out to be the prince. She doesn't know that right away, and they really like each other, they really hit it off, but for various reasons, it doesn't look like it's going to work out for them. So our main character, Kate, who is the fairy godmother, she also gets a job. Like, her latest client is somebody's essentially paying for the Cinderella character to be matched up with a different prince, with John's older brother, I think. And so a lot of like shenanigans and confusion ensue with Kate and John trying to figure out how they can pursue this relationship when it doesn't look like it's going to work long term, but they both really like each other. In addition to Kate trying to get Cinderella, or Ellie, I think her name is, Relly in this version, trying to get her happy ending. And then with all of that going on, something also goes wrong with Kate's like fairy godmothers Ink job or company, and specifically with the love potion and the way they've been using it. And this was a really fun and really weird and just very cute and wholesome book. I had a great time reading this. Some of the plot is just bonkers, like not even the stuff I was summarizing, but like some of the weird like subplots and the way that things are resolved or not resolved. Like, some of this book is a little bit bananas, but I still really enjoyed it. I really liked Kate as a main character. I thought her and John's relationship was really sweet. I would have liked maybe for there to be a little more like build up, but that's mainly just personal preference because I tend to enjoy really slow burn relationships. Like, I don't think it felt too fast for them. I also really liked the humor in this book and the way it played with fairy tale tropes in a really clever and fun way. This is definitely a book that doesn't take itself too seriously, while at the same time I think drawing attention to like some of the issues that can come up in fairy tales or in fantasy. Actually, one of my favorite things about this book is the way that love potion is treated like the really messed up thing that it is. Like, it wasn't just brushed over, it actually became a pretty serious plot point that that some of the characters were like, this is really unethical, like this is taking away people's free will. And I just like really appreciated that. I also really liked Relly's character. Initially I was not sure how I would feel about her, but she just ended up being a lot of fun. There's kind of a side romance involving her that I thought was really cute, even though that one was like definitely insta-love. It kind of didn't bother me because it was just cute. And I also really love one of the last scenes in this book, like the ending and like the resolution for some things. It was just really cool. I feel like you need to be in a very particular mood for this book, and also to really like fairy tale retellings and to want to see something kind of wacky and creative like this. And I could see why it would be like over the top for some people, but I had a lot of fun with it, and I gave Fairy Godmothers Ink 3.75 stars. Next, I finished Beyond the Black Door by A.M. Strickland, and this is a fantasy novel. So we follow our main character Kamai, and she can actually walk into people's dreams, which is a very rare ability, and it's very regulated in this fantasy world. Like, people aren't supposed to have it and not tell the people in charge. And her mother is a dreamwalker too, and when Kamai dreamwalks, there's this black door, and her mother has always told her, do not ever open that door. Kamai's mother actually ends up getting killed. Kamai ends up opening the black door, and the rest of the book is kind of about what happens as a result of that, and also as a result of her mother getting murdered. Kamai starts finding out some things about what her mother was actually involved in, because she knew her mother was a prostitute and kind of like involved in some spying related to that, but she didn't really know the extent of what her mother did. And so the book is about Kamai trying to figure that out and figure out who killed her mother and if she can kind of get revenge on them, and also learning more about her own abilities. So this was a very interesting reading experience for me. Initially I was having a hard time kind of getting into this book. Like, I thought the world was interesting. I liked the writing overall, but things weren't really happening yet. And then Kamai actually ends up going to stay with her birth father, who she never met, and she ends up getting a lot more involved in kind of like the politics of this world, and other characters who are involved with some things that her mother was a part of. And I feel like once that happened, things really started picking up. I started really enjoying the story a lot more. Another thing I want to mention is Kamai is actually asexual, and it was really great to see that in a fantasy story especially. We really don't see a lot of that. I also really liked some of the supporting characters as well. Kamai's guard in particular, I can't remember that character's name, but I really enjoyed them. There's also like a potential love interest character that she meets who was also kind of interesting. He was one of those characters where like you as the reader and even Kamai could like tell that he wasn't telling her everything and there was something going on, but it didn't bother me because I could understand why Kamai would be interested enough in him that she would like continue to talk to him. I still thought the political intrigue of this book was really great. Like, I found the story really interesting once we started getting more of that and we started seeing Kamai figure things out and kind of like work with other characters. Like, some of the twists or the plot developments in this book were really good, I think, and really well executed. And one of my favorite things about this book is the way that queerness was explored and the way it was shown as this very like thoughtful part of the world building and of these characters' lives, and the way that Kamai found so much acceptance from these people after feeling for a long time like she was broken because she did not feel this sexual attraction that everyone else almost seemed to. And there were a lot of like little things about that I think were executed so beautifully. Like one of the characters is actually trans, and after this character like comes out to Kamai, she says afterwards like, do you want me to use different pronouns for you? Like, what do you want me? And the character says like, no, like I'm not ready for that. And Kamai and the other characters just like completely respect that. There were a few moments where like just because these characters were also queer, it doesn't mean they like immediately understood where one of them was like coming from. They could like work through this and still be very supportive of each other even if they didn't quite understand everything right away. So the way that queerness was portrayed in this book and the way it was shown to be this beautiful part of the characters and of the world building, it was just done beautifully and with so much care and thoughtfulness, and like I said, it was one of my favorite parts of the book. There was actually a point near the end of the book, or maybe like 3/4 of the way through, where it almost felt like too many plot twists or plot developments. Like there was a lot happening and I found it almost like confusing with like how quickly things were changing. And after that I like realized what was going on and I was like, oh, actually that's really clever. And another thing I loved is the ending of this book. Like the way it pulled the story together and the way that A.M. Strickland did some like somewhat unusual things with certain characters, and I just like overall really enjoyed this. So I gave Beyond the Black Door 4 stars. Next I finished Korean Children's Favorite Stories by Kim So-eun and illustrated by Jung Kyung-sim. And this is pretty much what it sounds like. They are various like Korean folklore type stories that have been collected in one book, and I think these are supposed to be ones that are like pretty popular or like representative of Korean folklore. And I don't have a lot to say about this. I thought it was really well done. I really enjoyed reading these stories. It's also really interesting to see like different animals that are considered dangerous or that are considered to be like allies or like good guys in Korean folklore. That was really interesting, and I thought the art was really lovely as well. Some stories I definitely liked more than others, but overall I liked this. I think it was really fun. And I give Korean Children's Favorite Stories 3.75 stars. Next, I finished The Quest for Shakespeare by Joseph Pierce, The Bard of Avon and the Church of Rome. This is a nonfiction book that attempts to potentially answer the question of what Shakespeare's own personal and religious beliefs were, which is a big discussion in academic circles. There's a lot we don't know about his personal life, and there have been a lot of different theories about whether or not he was Anglican, like a practicing Anglican, or possibly a Catholic recusant, which was illegal at that time in England, and like various other theories. And this author actually initially set out to write this project or research this book thinking that he was going to find that he was not Catholic. Like he had heard of that theory, but he didn't really think there was a lot to support it. But in the course of his research, he actually came to believe that that actually is a strong possibility, and that does seem to be the most likely explanation for a lot of the facts of Shakespeare's life and some things that he wrote about and things like that. And I found this really interesting. This is a theory that we had discussed in my Shakespeare courses, and I found Joseph Pierce's research and arguments to be for the most part pretty persuasive. Of course, it's hard to ever know for sure. We probably won't ever know for sure what Shakespeare personally believed, especially because it's very difficult to find physical evidence or textual evidence of a belief that people were being executed for. Obviously, people weren't going to flaunt that or leave evidence for that in many cases, but based on what we know about his family and Shakespeare's marriage, the fact that he went out of his way to get married in a church where there was kind of an undercover Catholic priest, near the end of his life, the purchase of his house and what that was used for before and after he owned it, the sheer number of his friends who were very well-known Catholic recusants, like the fact that it's unlikely somebody would associate with that kind of like dangerous person unless they were themselves one of them, or at least pretty sympathetic, and even including the fact that some of his writings, when he made references to the Catholic Church or Catholic practices, those were actually correct, and that was really unusual at the time. So those are just a few of the arguments that Joseph Pierce gives, and like I said, I found this really interesting and for the most part pretty convincing. There were some points where Pierce was like analyzing certain sections of his plays and using that to draw conclusions about like what he meant, like this double meaning about what Shakespeare was really saying. I found those in general to be a little less persuasive. Like I feel like it's hard to draw conclusions from that. I really enjoyed the writing. Pierce has this really interesting style of writing that's really engaging, but like a tiny bit old-fashioned, but in a way that I don't think was over the top. And I also found some of the like relevant kind of tangential information to be super interesting. Like we never really covered this period very much, at least in the schools that I went to. So it was really interesting learning about that. Like the fact that like not only could you be tortured and executed if you were a Catholic, but you weren't allowed to attend college like or higher education. You weren't allowed to vote. The so-called Somerville plot was literally one man who was probably mentally distressed or disturbed, who had said that he would like to kill the queen. I believe he was executed for it, and I believe some of his family members were tortured and executed for it. Some were imprisoned. So it set off all of this tragedy, and it was like one guy. I feel like when we hear about the Somerville plot, they make it seem like it was this big deal, and it really wasn't. There were a couple of things I didn't really like about this book. One of them is that there's sometimes where Pierce comes across as believing like the only lens that matters is the one that the author was writing from. And I can see why in the context of this book he would be really focusing on the author's like historical and like personal lens that he was writing from, because obviously that's what the book is about. But there were places where it seems like he was saying that just in general the only lens that matters when looking at a text is the one that the author had themselves, which I don't personally think is true. Like for example, I will fight anybody who says that Pride and Prejudice is not a feminist book, even though Jane Austen was writing long before that label was a thing. Like it's definitely important to know what the author themselves believed or possibly believed, or like their historical or cultural context. But I don't think that's the only lens you can ever look at something through. And then the other major issue I had is there's a short chapter on the possibility of Shakespeare being gay, which is again a very important discussion in academic circles. And Pierce thinks that that was really unlikely, like he doesn't think Shakespeare was. And the reasons he gives are, one, that the way that men used to express affection and friendship for each other is much closer to the way we write romance today, which I think is true to an extent. Like that's a little bit plausible. Two, that most members of society at that time, and especially Christians, would have considered that a mortal sin, so it's unlikely that Shakespeare would have put those references in his plays or acted on those feelings himself, or even acknowledged that he had those feelings. And three, that because of this, modern scholars should be careful not to put modern interpretations onto historical figures like that. And like I said, the first reason I can kind of see where he's coming from, but otherwise I don't find that convincing. Personally, I do find it very likely that Shakespeare was gay, possibly bisexual, based on various things, but the sonnets are one reason. But otherwise, I don't really find his reasons convincing. There have been queer people around forever, and there have been queer religious people around forever, and just because they were not written about or acknowledged does not mean they didn't exist. Obviously, they were around with varying degrees of openness, but like I don't think those reasons were convincing for me personally. It was a pretty short chapter, but that was just one thing where I'm like, I don't buy this. And finally, I want to mention something that didn't bother me personally, but I could see bothering other readers, so I want to mention that. And that is that Joseph Pierce oftentimes will kind of adopt the tone of who or what he's discussing or quoting. So for example, if he's quoting and analyzing dismissive or condescending historians, he will be dismissive and condescending right back in the way that he kind of responds to those texts or arguments. And likewise with some of the discussions of religion, he kind of adopts the tone of what would have been said at the time. So there's discussion of like the true church, meaning the Catholic Church, and whether or not somebody was saved at the time that they died, which would mean they had been baptized and things like that. I think that was a choice made based on the history he was discussing, and like it made sense. He was kind of keeping the tone cohesive with what he was discussing, but do keep that in mind if you're thinking of picking this up. But overall, I really enjoyed this, and I gave The Quest for Shakespeare 4 stars. Next, I finished The Kingdom of Back by Marie Lu, and this was a buddy read with Amanda from The Curly Reader and Victoria from The Musical Bookworm. And this is a historical fantasy book that is about Mozart's sister, Nannerl, who was actually a real historical person, and we know very little about her, but we know that she was apparently very talented as her famous brother, but for historical sexist reasons, she was not really allowed to pursue that in the same way. And so this book, we are following Nannerl as the main character, and we have this historical setting of Vienna in, I think this is going to show how little I know about Mozart. So we have that historical element blended with a fantastical element, because Nannerl and her brother, they end up discovering this kind of magical land or kingdom that they can travel to. And so the story kind of takes place in both of those. We have the very grounded story of Nannerl trying to navigate this very sexist world where her choices are very limited despite her great talent. And you know, she's watching her brother get all of this praise and all of these opportunities while she's not getting the same thing. So we have that story, and we also have this like developing magical world and what Nannerl and Mozart are doing there. They end up meeting this kind of fairy person named Hyacinth, and so we get to know him as well. And I really, really enjoyed this. I know this has gotten pretty mixed I guess pretty low reviews overall. I really liked Nannerl as a main character, and the themes that this book explores about the way that she just had so few options despite her talent. I think the sibling relationship between her and her brother was really powerful. We really focused on this really complicated relationship between Nannerl and her brother, because of course she loves him, but there's always that undercurrent of like, why does he get to do so much more when I'm just as good, kind of thing, which I found really fascinating. I really enjoyed the writing and the setting and the atmosphere. Like the setting of Vienna is not one I have read about a lot, and I really liked the descriptions. And also the way that Marie Lu blended historical events into this fantastical story she was telling. I just thought that was really brilliant. I think Marie Lu really created a strong sense of place without overdoing it on the descriptions. I really enjoyed the fantasy elements as well, and that's something that I know not everybody enjoyed. I think you have to go into this book knowing that it's not going to be a really concrete and explained kind of fantasy world. Not everything is explained and you just kind of have to accept parts of it, which I was okay with, but I know a lot of people didn't like. I also found Hyacinth to be a really fascinating character and trying to figure out what his motivations were, what kind of character he was. I loved the descriptions of music in this book and the way that that was incorporated in the story, and that was such an important thing to Nannerl, and the fact that it's a thing that she loves that she's not always allowed to do in the same way. And the ways that she is allowed to perform is very much limited by this idea of women being like decorative almost. So like she can perform when she's all dressed up and beautiful and young, but once she starts getting into like marriageable age, that becomes shocking, and she's not allowed to do that anymore, and she's not allowed to compose music because that is something that men exclusively are allowed to do. And I just really liked this. I also really liked the ending. I thought it was really powerful, and it was very fitting for this story and for what Marie Lu was doing. And I think the author's note also was really great because she talks about not just the fact that the Kingdom of Back is like based on a real game that Nannerl and her brother would play, but also on the fact that this is a real passion project of Marie Lu's. And I think another reason this book gets such low reviews is a lot of people didn't like the ending. This ending fit the book, and I think it still felt satisfying in a way that also called attention to the themes of this book. Yeah, I thought this was great. There were some parts in the middle where it sort of dragged, but other than that, I really enjoyed this, and I gave The Kingdom of Back 4 stars. Next, I finished The Silence of Bones by June Her, and this is a historical mystery novel that is set in Korea in the year 1800. It's set during the Joseon era, and we follow our main character Sul, who is this young girl who's kind of like an indentured servant almost at the police investigation bureau in the city where she lives. I can't remember if it's the capital or not. And there's this young inspector who she has been working with and kind of slowly getting to know and becoming friends with. Purely platonic, he's starting to really respect her opinions and her abilities, and so they've been working together for a while now. And then a noblewoman is murdered, and Sul kind of gets drawn into investigating this, and it starts looking like this inspector is the prime suspect, and so she's now trying to clear his name and to figure out what really happened to this woman, and how this murder connects to some other deaths in the city and some other political tensions and other things that are going on. So I really enjoyed this novel. I thought it was brilliant. I really liked the story, like the actual mystery aspect, and figuring out what was going on with Sul and how this fit into other issues that were happening in the city and in the kingdom as a whole. It was also just really interesting to have a mystery that was set in this time period. I also think the writing and the atmosphere was done really well. There's this feeling of melancholy throughout the book that I think really spoke to what was going on in the city and in Joseon and what Sul was going through herself, because she definitely has some difficult things in her past. There are other characters who have some really hard things that they have gone through or are currently going through. But even with that kind of heaviness to this book sometimes, I was still really engaged with it. I still really wanted to pick it up. In addition to those heavier elements, I think being handled really well and really thoughtfully, there were also other elements in the story to kind of balance those feelings out. The only things that didn't work for me so much with this novel are, one, that some things about the way that certain elements are resolved, I was not quite satisfied with, and also that there were some elements of like social commentary that I expected to be more, I guess, fleshed out. Like we see Sul starting to notice these issues of prejudice and mistreatment and things that shouldn't be happening. Like I'm pretty sure we were supposed to feel that Sul was slowly starting to realize these things were wrong, which was great, but I just expected those to be handled in a little more, I guess, extensive way, if that makes sense. Like considering what an important part of the book those were and how serious those were, I just expected it to be done a little more fully. But overall, I really enjoyed this. I thought this book was fantastic, and I gave The Silence of Bones 4 stars. Next, I finished All American Boys by Jason Reynolds and Brendan Keeley, and this is a contemporary novel that deals with police brutality and racial profiling. So this is a dual perspective novel, and we follow two main characters. One of them is a black boy named Rashad, and his story starts when he is accused of stealing at a store and he is violently assaulted by a policeman, and he ends up in the hospital. And then our other main character is a white boy named Quinn, and he witnesses some of what is happening. And the book is about their two stories and how these two American boys are treated very differently and have very different experiences because of racism. And the important thing in this book is not that the two characters' stories intersect. That does eventually like kind of happen, but the point of this book is really about them separately. And there are similarities, but also the fact that because Rashad is black and because Quinn is white, their experiences are vastly different. And also another thing I liked about this book, because by the way, I loved this, another thing I thought was really great with this book is that it's not a story about like the black characters teaching Quinn like to be a better person. Quinn starts realizing these things himself, and he starts seeking out information himself, and I just really liked that. Like, he wasn't like putting that emotional labor onto the Black characters in this book. I also loved the writing of this. I have loved everything I've read from Jason Reynolds, so this was no exception. And I also really liked the parts that Brendan Keeley wrote, because he wrote Quinn's perspective and Jason Reynolds was writing from Rashad's perspective. Initially, when we got the first chapter or so from Quinn, I wasn't quite sure how I was going to feel. Like, it felt kind of like it was telegraphing the message of the book, but that went away really quick, and I really ended up thinking that both of these perspectives were written brilliantly. The character development is also really good. I mean, primarily Quinn is the one who we see really like changing his mind throughout this book and realizing that like he can't just be neutral. Like, if you're neutral in the face of racism, that's not actually being neutral. You're helping the oppressors, and you're helping the people who are hurting others. And Rashad and Quinn are also both on the same basketball team, and so we also see like their different experiences with that, and the way that like this book does such a good job of showing like how when people try and say that, oh, this is going to be a like politics-free space, or like a controversy-free space, it's like, you can't do that, because not everybody can leave those things at the door, and the fact that you're saying people can is an expression of privilege. And the way that Quinn doesn't get that at first, but he starts to see that more and more. Like, because he's not perfect. He definitely like messes up in this journey. And I really enjoyed some of the other characters as well. Like Rashad's friends I really loved. His brother was a really interesting character. I also liked Jill, who's a friend of Quinn's. This book also shows how people who are racist are sometimes people that you know and have fond memories of and have been important parts of your lives. Like, we see Quinn really struggle with the fact that people he has grown up with his whole life, people who have meant a lot to him and helped him through some really hard times, can also be racist, like can also be part of this horrible violence and hatred. I also really loved Rashad as a character. Like, we see him like not only dealing with the aftermath of this violence, which is obviously a big part of the book, but we also see his family and like how family expectations have affected him. And we see like his interests and how this assault by a policeman is kind of like defining his life right now, even though he wants to be more than that. I feel like I'm kind of rambling, but I thought it was really fantastic. I gave it 5 stars. I do think it was kind of weird that, unless I'm completely misremembering, I don't think the book actually mentioned the Black Lives Matter movement, which I thought was odd because they did mention names of other movements and other victims. Like, they talk about Say Her Name, which is about the way that violence against Black women is not really acknowledged in the same way, like the way that we forget their names or don't say their names. So that is mentioned specifically, as well as several victims of police brutality. So I just thought that was kind of like odd or unusual. Like, but my edition that came with I think like an award acceptance speech from the authors, and I believe in that speech they did mention Black Lives Matter. And I gave All American Boys 5 stars. Next, I finished The Other Bennett Sister by Janice Hadlow, and this was a buddy read with my wonderful friend Margaret from The Word Nerd. And this is, as you can probably see, a Jane Austen retelling, and we follow Mary as the main character. And this is set after the events of Pride and Prejudice, so we see Mary get the opportunity to kind of find her own way and to figure out who she is and what she wants from life. And I really enjoyed this. So something I had been hearing, even from people who really enjoyed this book, is that the beginning chunk is really kind of slow and boring and repetitive because it's basically just Pride and Prejudice. And I actually didn't feel like that. My favorite parts of the book were definitely closer to the middle and the end, but I didn't dislike the beginning. I actually feel like Janice Hadlow did a really good job of like showing Mary's perspective in Pride and Prejudice in scenes that we didn't see her in. Like, sometimes in retellings you get like there's a few scenes where it's almost a like line by line kind of redo of the original story, and that didn't happen here. Like, we were seeing like additional scenes that weren't in Pride and Prejudice, or we were seeing what Mary was doing during some scenes from Pride and Prejudice where we hadn't seen her before. So like, I actually didn't mind that part, and I thought it was really important to really get to know Mary as a character and to really feel for her. Like, my heart hurt for her so much, like from the beginning of this book, because we really see how she has been completely defined by the fact that she is like the only plain Bennett sister, and nobody is willing to let her be anything else. And we see how her low self-esteem, because of the way that other people have treated her, has kind of fed into, like, it's even like poisoned her interests and her loves for things. Like, she loves reading and like scholarly pursuits, and even that has kind of been affected by the way that other people view her and how she's like, well, this is all I can be now. So I was really invested in this book and in Mary from the beginning. I really enjoyed the writing. I think Janice Hadlow did a great job of like kind of capturing that era, like that feeling of when Jane Austen's books were written, without being like a copycat. There was a couple points where she did do that, which I'll get to later. But overall, I think the writing of this book was really good. I loved like the middle and end, because without giving too much away, we see Mary spend time with some family who are actually really loving and who actually like want her to be happy and want her to love herself too, and I just, like, those parts made my heart so happy. They're some of my favorite characters in Pride and Prejudice, and so the fact that we get to see them in this book and being good to Mary like she deserves was just wonderful. I also loved the romance in this book. I mentioned a while back on Twitter when I was talking about how I needed to film this wrap up, that one of the books made it onto my book boyfriends shelf, and this was the one. I love the love interest in this so much. I really love him. And just for some context, I think I added only 3 books to my book boyfriend shelf in all of last year, and that felt like kind of a lot. So yeah, it's pretty rare, but I just really loved him. I loved his relationship with Mary and the fact that they bonded over literature, and seeing Mary like start to find the value and beauty in poetry or other kinds of literature that she wasn't used to reading or like treating as seriously. And like, it's not like she changes and she like doesn't care about reading what she enjoys anymore, but she starts to realize that those are not the only kinds of writing with value. So I just loved that journey. I thought the themes that this book handles about beauty and the way that we put people in boxes, especially women, based on that. And like, obviously it's not quite as bad as it was in this time period, but it still happens. We still define people based on their physical appearance, and especially in the way that we assume, like, we treat people who are not like conventionally beautiful, like this like Western ideal, not only that they have less worth and are just like less like interesting or pleasing to look at, but we also kind of have this underlying assumption that like, well, you can't have a beautiful soul then, or a personality, or like this rich like inner life and dreams and like these interesting thoughts. And like, I just think that this book does such a good job of exploring that and showing how, even though Mary was considered plain and nobody ever lets her forget it, she still had all of these wishes and all of this like personality and heart and love and compassion. And anyway, yeah, I really, really enjoyed this. The reason I gave The Other Bennett Sister 4 stars instead of higher is because there was a conflict near the end of the book that I think was dragged out way, way too long. Like, I think it makes sense as a conflict to happen in this book, but it got a little bit frustrating because it went on so long, so I didn't love that. And there's also this scene near the end that was a very like unnecessary line-by-line copy from Pride and Prejudice with just like a different character, with just like different characters involved. But other than that, I really, really enjoyed this book. And like I said, I gave it 4 stars. Next, I finished Under a Dancing Star by Laura Wood, and this is a Much Ado About Nothing retelling that is set in Italy in, I think, the 1930s. Yeah, so it starts off in England because our main character, Bea, or Beatrice, she's English, and she ends up getting invited to spend the summer, I think, in Italy with her uncle and her cousin Hero. And this is like a prequel to Much Ado About Nothing because there's a line in the play that kind of implies that Beatrice and Benedict might have known each other before the play started, and that's what this book does. And I had forgotten this was a prequel, so maybe if I had known that, I would have gone in with a little bit lower expectations because I don't tend to enjoy prequels, but I love Much Ado About Nothing. I was excited about an Italian historical fiction take on it, or one that was set in Italy, not with Italian characters, and unfortunately I kind of hated this book. I'm really upset about it because Much Ado About Nothing is one of my favorite plays, and Laura Wood has written one of my favorite books, which was A Sky Painted Gold. Yeah, I still love that one, but this one was not good in my opinion. The only things I liked about this book were the Italian setting, and there were a couple of side characters who were like 2 lesbian aunts, basically, who we see for a little bit later in the book, who were wonderful. I loved them. Those were the only things I liked about this book. So now into everything I didn't like. Okay, I'm just gonna go down the list here, so I don't know if this is gonna be in like an order that makes sense, but the themes, like the serious themes that this book touched on, I think were done really badly. One of the things that I liked about A Sky Painted Gold is that even though it was primarily like a kind of soft like romance story, there were other issues that were touched on, like homophobia and racism and like other kind of issues of the time period, and they weren't like huge parts of the book, but I think they were touched on in a way that felt respectful and thoughtful, even if they weren't a huge part of the story. And with this book, I really didn't feel like that. This is set in the 1930s in Italy, during the time when fascism was becoming more popular, and it just felt like really weird the way that was like randomly brought up at some points in the book, because we don't really get anything about that for the first chunk of the story, and then like all of a sudden we have a few scenes that are like really focused about it, and like suddenly we're realizing that like characters are like fascist leaders and all of this, and then we kind of go back to like the romance stuff and the other plot things, and then like the end of the book, in like the last couple chapters, I think, like the last few pages before the epilogue, like one of the other characters gets kicked out because of the rising tide of anti-Semitism in Italy as well. And it just was like, it was so weird. I really, really didn't like how those serious issues were just kind of brushed off and then like randomly brought in when they weren't really dealt with or like handled. And then I also really hated the romance, which is unfortunate because Beatrice and Benedict are one of my like probably top 5 OTPs of all time. And I could not stand them. I did not like the scenes of them together. They had like no reason for being interested in each other except that they were attracted to each other, which is fine, but that's not what I find interesting to read about. It was that kind of relationship where it's like they take turns like getting humiliated in front of the other, basically, especially on B's side. Like she was like always getting embarrassed in front of the guy, which I really don't like that. I don't like, it makes it feel kind of like unequal when one character always has like the, I don't know, the upper hand when it comes to like feeling comfortable. What was his name even? Ben. He had like very, very little personality, and B herself, I loathed. This makes me so upset. So Beatrice had, or B, is a very, very like not like other girls kind of character, and that never gets any better throughout the book. And the reason that we are supposed to believe she is special and not like other girls is that she likes science, and that she has this quirky, endearing habit of like talking about animal mating practices in polite society, like in polite company. Like that's it. That's like her whole personality, is she'll just like spit random science facts like at times when it doesn't make any sense. Like that was really her defining personality trait. Also, Hero, who I actually liked, she was one of the other characters who I kind of enjoyed, who is B's cousin that she goes to stay with. I thought she was really great and promising, and guess what? She like barely mattered in this book, and that makes me so upset. And I know that this is a prequel, so you could argue like they weren't quite as close as they would have been in like the main story of Much Ado About Nothing, but are you telling me that the character who has one of the greatest lines in literature, like in the original play when Hero has been hurt and Beatrice wants to defend her, and she says, "Would that I were a man, I would eat his heart in the marketplace." Like, are you telling me that Beatrice, who like defends her friend and cousin so hard and is like so feminist and so like supportive of other women, are you telling me that that's who this character was supposed to be? Because I don't believe it. Yeah, I'm just like getting incoherent because I'm so upset. So obviously I really did not like this book. Like I think like as a story by itself, it was not very good, and as a retelling of a brilliant play, I also really don't think it was good. I gave Under a Dancing Star 2 stars because there were like glimmers of things that I enjoyed or that could have been better. Oh, another thing I thought was weird is like they spent the whole time in Italy, but I feel like there were very few characters who were actually Italian. And when they were there, they were like kind of stereotypical. Like one of the only ones who we spend any significant time with. And I was just really sad with the way her storyline went too, because I forgot that was another thing that I didn't like, is there was kind of an implication near the end of the book where like they were talking about like an abusive relationship, I think, and like one of the characters said something like, "I'll be okay because I have a stronger constitution than like this other person." And I was like, excuse me, what? Like, you can't just like protect yourself from domestic violence by being a strong person. Like, that's not how it works. Anyway, you know what? Maybe I should drop this rating down because the longer I talk about it, the more I hate this book. I did read it quickly, but that's about the only other good thing I can say about it. So next, I finished House of Gold by Natasha Solomons, and I actually talked about this book in my recent underhyped books recommendations video. I will link that down below, as well as Hannah's blog post if you haven't seen those yet. So you have already heard a little bit about this book, but this is a World War I historical fiction novel. We are following a Jewish family called the Goldbaums, who I think are based on a real Jewish family called the Rothschilds, who were a very wealthy family in Europe at this time. So we follow several main characters and several point of view characters, but I think one of the more prominent ones is a young woman named Greta, and at the beginning of the book, she is kind of like married off or like put into this arranged marriage that's essentially like a business merger to a like distant cousin of theirs, so like from a distant branch of the family, and she doesn't really want to do it, but for various reasons she and her new husband Albert end up going through with it. And so the first like half of the book is about like their relationship and how like the two of them, like neither really wanted this, but we see them starting to spend more time together and maybe start to think like they could be happy like this. Like we're seeing this like slowly growing relationship between them that I really enjoyed. I actually was surprised at how like deeply invested I got in their relationship. I wasn't sure how I was going to be feel about it at the beginning, but I ended up like really caring about it. Despite the rocky beginning, there are a few scenes in particular where I was like, I don't know how I feel about this. But I ended up really liking both of them and their relationship. And Greta as a character too was so interesting because you kind of like at the beginning, you feel like she's this kind of like stereotypical wealthy socialite. And as the book goes on, you realize that there is so much more to her than that. I ended up actually really liking Greta as a main character. And something else I thought was really cool is I think Natasha Solomons did a great job of showing how Greta's priorities and things that she wanted out of her life changed very organically as she got older and as situations changed, just like throughout the book. I feel like this is, I think, one of the best examples of that, because I think when that character arc is done badly, it can feel really jarring and like kind of upsetting. I'm thinking of the Anne of Green Gables books, the later books in that series, but this one was done beautifully. And I also really liked the writing. Right from the beginning of the book, I really, really liked the way Solomons wrote, and like the perfect amount of description and humor and like clever language and just like characterization. I just think the writing was really brilliant. I also think this book handled really important themes really thoughtfully. We see how even wealthy families are not safe from anti-Semitism, and we see the way that that affects this family. The only things that I did not really enjoy about this book so much, like once World War I actually starts and we start getting like point of view chapters that are like set at the front or like during the war, I found that a little less engaging. I don't know if that was because I was so invested in the other things that were happening with the story, or if those chapters just weren't written as engagingly. And also the other thing, so this is gonna be like kind of spoilery, but it's a minor spoiler in the sense that it really doesn't affect most of the story, which was actually one of my problems with it. So if you don't want to hear this part, go ahead and skip. I will put a timestamp in the description box. There's this one plot point that really bothered me, and that was related to one of the characters had a girlfriend who the Goldbaum family like did not really approve of, and like they knew that they were dating, but they weren't gonna do anything about it. And eventually when the family steps in and is like, all right, you can't see her anymore, like both characters involved are really upset, and the woman, so the girlfriend, she actually kills herself. She dies by suicide. And the way that was handled by other characters really bothered me, like especially Greta, because like she gets kind of angry at her because she thinks that the way and the timing of what this woman did, she thinks that she was intentionally trying to like haunt her boyfriend for like the rest of his life, basically, and that he would never get over her. And Greta thought this was really selfish of her. And another thing, so the woman was actually pregnant at the time that she died by suicide, and so I understand that adding like an extra layer to the tragedy of this. And also like the way that, I think it was Greta, it might have been another character, the way that they kind of like dismissed the way that this relationship ended up as like, well, they always were like really over dramatic and more committed to the idea of romance than the actual relationship. Like the way that was kind of dismissed like bothered me. Yeah, so like there were a lot of things about that plot point that I think were not handled in the best way, and also that whole plot point felt unnecessary. Like this character wasn't even that important, but her story was handled in a way that I felt like was kind of upsetting. So that was the only other thing, but otherwise I think this book was really excellent, and I gave House of Gold 4 stars. And finally, the last book I read in, what month are we? July, because I'm so behind, is Nomad by R.J. Anderson. And this is the second book in the Swift series, now known as the Flight and Flame trilogy. I actually did a full spoiler-free review for the first and second book, which I will link down below if you haven't seen it yet. But I was rereading this, and the first book follows our main character Ivy, and she is a Piskie, and she lives in this like underground mine shaft. Her and her people live there to protect themselves from humans and from like predators and everything. And this is set in the modern day. It's kind of like a contemporary fantasy series, but it still retains that feeling of like old world magic, which I really love. It incorporates a lot of Cornish folklore, which is also really interesting. And in the first book, Ivy has grown up knowing that her mother has disappeared, and she's been told that she was taken or attacked by these creatures called Spriggans, which I found out recently that I and several other people have been saying that word wrong. It's actually Spriggans, not Spriggans. So Ivy has grown up hearing that that's who took her mother from her. And then at the beginning of the first book, she starts finding out some things that makes her wonder if that's actually true, and that there might actually be more things going on with her mother's disappearance. And so she ends up rescuing a Spriggan named Richard, or she thinks that's his name, to try to figure out what is going on with Ivy's mother, and also with this wider mystery and danger. But I love this one even more than book one. I love the way Ivy and Richard's relationship has developed and changed. I just love them both as characters, and I love them together. I thought the direction the plot is going in the second book was also really interesting. I love the themes in this series, which was another thing I highlighted in that review, is like the way that this series handles so many important topics while also blending it with this really interesting story. I also forgot how much I loved the ending of Nomad, so that was a really great surprise. I am so excited for book 3, and I gave Nomad 4.5 stars. Okay everybody, so those are all of the books that I read in July. Thank you guys so much for watching. I will see you soon with another video, and I hope you love the next book you read. Bye!